So welcome. It's a privilege to introduce Brian Bergstein, who is the science technology journalist in Boston. Works for Wired magazine, and if you haven't subscribed to Wired, you ought to. It's an interesting magazine. Keeps you abreast, update on all sorts of technologies. Brian is a contributing editor and former executive editor of MIT Technology Review. He's also helped to lead an editorial team that was nominated twice for the National Magazine Award for General Excellence. He was a founding editor of Neo Life, a publication begun by one of the founders of Wired to chronicle the ways technology is changing biology. Brian has covered Silicon Valley and the telecom industry for the Associated Press, has served as the new agency's technology and media editor from 2008 to 2010. He's a former Knight Fellow in Science Journalism at MIT and is a graduate of Northwestern University. So let me ask Brian to come up and do the presentation.
Thanks, Simon. Thank you. Make sure this is working here. All right. There we go. Over the next 2 years, ING, a Dutch bank, plans to train more than 3,000 of its employees in artificial intelligence. The company's head of robotics and AI told researchers writing for Sloan Management Review that these employees are, quote, critical people for scaling up machine learning and other advanced computing technologies. So who are these people? Who are these people who are so crucial to the success of the company's AI endeavors? Are they ING's IT people? Are they data scientists, number crunchers? No, these are all non-technical people. These are people out in the business units. And yet they're crucial, and they're getting trained in this technology because they're going to need to understand how it works. They're going to, more importantly than knowing how it works, they're going to also have to pull off changes in the business that will be enabled by the technology and required by it. I mention this because I think this little anecdote goes to the heart of what companies need to do to prepare themselves to take advantage of advanced computing, or AI. So as we've heard throughout the day, remarkable things are becoming possible in what this program calls intelligent systems. But in this next hour, I want to shift the conversation just slightly to give you some things to think about tomorrow and to take back to your companies. So here's the shift I'd like you to consider. The intelligent systems of the future, the ones that really matter, are not really the sensor networks or the computers or the software you'll deploy. The truly intelligent system, the one that really matters, is your own organization, enlightened by advanced computing, but always cognizant of its limitations and structured accordingly. And I think the companies that truly come to terms with this in the next few years will be the ones that lead the way when it comes to putting the technology to use. These companies know that these systems can't just be bolted on to their companies as the companies exist today. These companies aren't just asking what the technology can do for them, they're asking what it'll mean for the technology to be a coworker. They know there's a lot they need to overhaul for the technology to truly be fruitful and deployed wisely. And putting this mindset into practice it starts with training sessions like the ones I mentioned at ING. Companies have to fully involve people in the business units in the discussions of what computing can and can't do. People all over a company need to understand and explain what's going on. And this works in the opposite direction too. Smart companies are taking pains to ensure that the software developers and data analysts have a rich understanding of what the business actually needs and what business data actually reveals. I've got 3 main reasons why, whoops, wrong way. Let's see. I am not modeling an intelligent system right here. Jim, you want to come help me out real quick? Sorry about that. What's going on here, man? back with you now. Okay, so there's three main reasons why I think it's useful to shift the emphasis from intelligent systems technologies to intelligent organizations. I've got a short-term reason, a mid-range reason, and a longer-term idea that really goes to the heart, I think, of what you all will have to be thinking about over the next few years. So first, we have the very practical near-term reason. So of all the technologies that get lumped together today as AI, machine learning is a good kind of general category for what's most promising. It's incredibly promising for businesses because machine learning raises the prospect that computers will get more and more astute over time as they incorporate more information. And we grasp that opportunity in a powerful way when we hear of machine learning being used to beat human champions at the game of Go or translate speech and so on. I spent much of 2017 putting together a special issue on artificial intelligence for MIT Technology Review. And that whole time, there was a general sense that machine learning was about to take the world by storm and upend the whole economy. And yet, here we are nearing the end of 2018, and it's actually still early days for machine learning in a lot of companies. So why is that? Well, it turns out, I think, that it's because the technology has been much harder to deploy in most companies than in research settings and closed world situations like games of Go. And overcoming those challenges will depend way more on human actions than on refinements of the technology itself. The second reason that it's useful to think about intelligent organizations that are putting the technology to smart use is that once companies are set up to take best advantage of the technology, the real money, so to speak, is not in automating existing business practices. It's in sparking transformations that only people can lead. And those are ones that are going to make new practices possible and new business models. I mean, another way to phrase this is that ideally you want to not just cut costs, but you also want to develop entirely new revenue opportunities. The technology can enable those opportunities, but only people can carry them out. And finally, the long-term idea here is that companies that put the emphasis on what they can achieve with the help of algorithmic technologies, rather than on the technologies themselves as something to bolt on, these companies are becoming more thoughtful about what algorithms actually do best, what they actually reveal and what they don't. What these companies understand at a fundamental level will be that accountability and explainability are crucial. People across an organization have to explain to customers, to each other, often to regulators, why some decision was made. And that will require companies to train employees to see the big picture across a business and understand what data analysis actually shows them and what its limitations are. So that's not easy. But this mindset will make a very big idea possible over the next decade. That big idea is that humans and machines working together, with each party doing what it does best, are better than either working alone. And companies that pull this off and get their employees to understand this will become better places to work. They'll have less drudgery and more imaginative work. Companies that embrace this ideal can make people more adept at their jobs, more fulfilled by their work, more productive, and perhaps even more thoughtful members of an algorithmically dense society. Those are genuine reasons for optimism at a difficult time. Now, before we dive into each of these three ideas in turn, I should just briefly set some context for where I'm coming from when I say that you should not think of the technology as the intelligent system. I don't think, I'm not being glib or dismissive of what we've been hearing about today. Impressive things are happening in specific domains, especially robotics, machine vision, speech recognition, machine translation. And many of you probably know from using advanced computing techniques in your own R&D organizations how they can make you more efficient at generating new hypotheses and testing them. To be clear, though, I don't think the technology itself has what amounts to intelligence, and I doubt that'll change by 2025. If it'll be helpful for me to go into the details on why that is, I'd be happy to do that in the questions at the end. But the short explanation for now is that while computers are getting better and better at perceiving the world, they're still very far from understanding it, let alone being able to reason about it. I actually don't see any active research endeavors that put us on a path where that changes anytime soon. There was a question this morning about quantum computing, and I would actually include quantum in that category as well. I think quantum has a lot of promise, but I don't think by 2025 it'll change this calculation of what we think of as intelligence. Anyway, because of this, I bring this up largely to say that it's why you won't hear me use the umbrella term AI very much. I think it's kind of meaningless. I think it confuses a lot of people. And so instead, whenever possible, I refer to more specific technologies, whether it's robotics or machine learning, what have you. Now, all that said, whether computers could be considered intelligent now or will in the next 3 to 7 years, I suspect that actually doesn't really matter much for what you all face in your organizations. It's a little bit of a distraction, actually, from what you face, because you're probably more concerned about what the technology can do, what it enables now, what it'll enable in the next few years. And you can do a heck of a lot already with machines that merely perceive aspects of the world. I mean, I'm amazed at all the ways people are throwing machines at tasks that are impossible for humans, like automatically detecting new forms of online fraud or analyzing minute changes in gene expression or designing useful new molecules from scratch. I was at a technical symposium at MIT a few weeks ago where one of the projects involved, as the researchers put it, using AI to analyze the question of which jobs will be eaten up by AI. And it was actually cool to meet a researcher from that project here, Daniel Rock, who is working on some similar work predicting the future of the economy. Anyway, so the field of play here is vast, even if there are only incremental advances in the underlying technology. David Cox, one of the co-leaders of the joint IBM-MIT lab, told me a few weeks ago, quote, "We're now in an era where even small wins, which is to say small improvements in the technology we already have, even small wins can be tremendously valuable." So the question for you, I think, is probably how your company can capitalize on all this. And that's what we'll be talking about in this hour. Now, if you find that some of the less technical stuff that we'll be discussing, some of the less technical stuff that's necessary, if it includes stuff that your organization is already doing, or at least knows it should be doing, like creating new methods for training employees or reskilling employees, breaking down barriers that keep data and business knowledge in silos, I think it's probably now time to accelerate those maneuvers. And that's the case no matter whether I'm right or wrong about what the state of computer intelligence will be in 2025. You know, Jim Redden talked this morning about visualizing all these alternative futures A through E and beyond. I think what I'm describing here, these changes are sort of the equivalent of something that would apply to all of these, sort of no matter how computer intelligence does or does not involve. It's like you need a good roof on your house, whether it drizzles or whether it pours. Okay, so let's drill down on reason number one. Machine learning has been hard to put into practice, and it takes a large portion of a company to overcome that. So how hard is it? This tweet actually made me laugh a couple weeks ago. It's from Pete Skammarok, and he's CEO of a company called SkipFlag. That's a company, it's now owned by Workday. It can take your company's IM chats and other internal communications and then use that to populate a knowledge base that anybody in the company can query for insights. So there's a lot of interesting technology at play there. He's also been the principal data scientist at LinkedIn. I know he's seen real live machine learning deployments. So I asked Pete why he thinks it's so hard. Why is there this kind of stumbling block? And he agrees with me that the human side of the equation is really the biggest problem. One huge reason is that machine learning technologies need lots of data if they're going to reveal new insights. You don't really know what's possible with these technologies until you can experiment with real data that's been carefully labeled. And then, if you want the systems to do anything meaningful, it needs to feed well-designed feedback loops. How to do that? Well, you know, as I mentioned earlier, and as other speakers have mentioned today, companies have to structure themselves on a fundamental level to facilitate coordination between the data teams and the business units. They often have to totally rethink how they obtain, manage, and reality check their data. And as Pete told me, these are his words, the talent, experience, and leadership to bridge the worlds of product design and machine learning are scarce. So I'm actually inclined to turn that around. I think you can think of that as an opportunity, something your company can lead the way on, perhaps. As for this concept I just mentioned of reality checking business data, it might be the best reason why data analysts have to work really closely with people in the business, not just the business leaders, but frontline people as well. Ted Dunning, who is the chief application architect at a data services company called MapR, recently gave me this example. So he's seen companies try to draw conclusions about customer behavior from clicks on their websites. Of course, there are interesting patterns, in those numbers. But in at least one case he was telling me about, the data scientists didn't know, as other people in the company did know, that in some given span, bots had flooded the website and totally polluted the training data. That's a kind of an obvious example, but it's the kind of things that can make the data that a system is working on meaningless. And many, many people in your company will need to develop extrasensory detection powers around anomalies. There will be anomalies in training data that don't reflect reality, and there will be anomalies in the real world that don't match the scenarios that the algorithms saw in their training and have baked into their assumptions. The mathematician and philosopher of science, Alfred Korzybski, said in the 1930s, a map is not the actual territory. Well, there's a reason Google didn't grab data for self-driving cars by just feeding them maps. They drove down every damn road. Now, that's an extreme example, but it's part of the mindset I'm talking about, of not assuming that some particular data set tells you enough. I recently heard of a large pharmaceutical company that wants to better analyze potentially dangerous drug interactions. To maximize the amount of information it can gather, it's going to its competitors to pull data on adverse side effects reported by consumers. So Ted Dunning, who I mentioned a minute ago, he nicely crystallized an aspect of this in a book that he and his colleague Ellen Friedman authored this summer. The book is about how to deploy AI. Oh, there we go. And what the authors are saying here is that data scientists might get excited about a new algorithm for statistical analysis, but you're much better off being rigorous with how you obtain and use that and how you think about what it means than to think you can throw a magic algorithm at any pile of information. And so, again, the most important thing here is to get data that accurately describes some aspect of the real world and that a computer can process and the rest of the business can act on. So, I'm talking a lot here about the human challenges of getting companies even ready to take advantage of machine learning. But the technical side can be tricky too. Back to Pete Scamarrock, who says it's 100 times harder, than just building a mobile application. That's because building a mobile application, while it might be tricky, it just requires companies to extend services from existing web applications. But machine learning requires entirely new systems for harvesting and analyzing data from all over a company. Even Google, which again has done about as well at using these technologies as any company in existence, struggles with this. This is a 2014 paper from 8 software engineers at Google, and they're referring to something called technical debt. That's the ongoing maintenance costs required by any given technology. So, some kinds of software require you to buy certain kinds of servers, or they require continuous patching, so on. That's technical debt. And machine learning, because it draws on data from all over an organization, generates so much technical debt, the Google authors put it, it's like using a high-interest credit card. They write in this paper that while using machine learning makes it possible to build a, quote, fantastically powerful toolkit for building complex systems quickly, it's dangerous to think of these quick wins as coming for free. On the contrary, you can easily incur massive ongoing maintenance costs from all the complexity. What causes all that complexity? In their words, hidden feedback loops, data dependencies, and then my favorite example is what they call changes in the external world. So all of this helps explain the first of 43 rules of machine learning that were put down in a paper by Martin Zinkovich, a research scientist at Google. And the first one is, it's okay to tread carefully, even at Google. Now, to be fair, some of this is changing. Some of the people who spoke at this afternoon's breakout sessions are technology vendors who can help with some of this. Depending on your business's needs, there's AI as a service platforms that might be quite useful, like SageMaker from Amazon Web Services. There's Einstein from Salesforce. There are things out there that let companies upload data sets and fuel real live services. They're not going to work for every company, though. We do hear of companies doing really interesting things with these kinds of AI in the cloud models, indexing video footage for some of the future use, testing out financial fraud models, building chatbots. And there's no doubt that this off-the-shelf capability is going to get a lot better. Machine learning is pretty much going to just become a standard part of software development. But the larger point remains, even if services like the ones I just described make sense for your company, you need to have truly good and meaningful data. And regardless of whether you hope to do the AI in-house or in the cloud or some hybrid, your company has to come to terms with the fact that these kinds of technologies might require new management practices. So Sanjay Srivastava, who is the chief digital officer at the IT services provider Genpact, he has a nice way of putting this. If you have a customer service team where 10 humans just failed to show up one day, you would know it right away. But if you have a chatbot or some other automated customer interaction system making errors in its relationships with customers, you might not know it right away. You might not know it for a month. So to take advantage of that technology, you need something new. Now you need people to staff a command and control system for the automated capability that you just built. There was a question in an earlier talk this morning about pricing and real-time pricing. I was speaking just last week to an executive at Wayfair, which is one of the most creative e-commerce vendors when it comes to using these technologies. And I asked him, why is it that if I look for a medicine cabinet on Wayfair, the exact same medicine cabinet costs the exact same, the price is the exact same on Amazon, Overstock, Build.com, and so on, down to the penny. And the reason is because algorithms are setting these prices within parameters set by humans. So if someone wants to lower their price, the algorithms are going to make that tactical decision in real time about whether to match that price. And they will just go ahead and do it, but there are sort of parameters set in place to keep the price from going too low or too high. Anyway, they have what is like a NASA command and control center. They are monitoring their automated system with people staffed 24/7 at banks of screens, monitoring, looking for demand hotspots and changes in prices and things like that. So there's a whole new management practice and a whole new human-driven capability to manage the technology. And that drives home how we're not talking about putting some function of your business on autopilot. Getting this right will require human discernment and continual revisions to the computer's jobs and other thoughtful and strategic endeavors that demand human involvement. So to be clear, none of what I'm saying about the difficulty of deploying machine learning is meant to justify inaction. And treading carefully is different from not walking down the path at all. As I mentioned earlier, and we'll discuss in more detail, and other speakers have addressed today, even today's versions of these systems technologies are making truly remarkable things possible. I think you probably can't take the risk of not trying to shape your company around these kinds of technologies. There's an interesting argument being made. In fact, I'm not quite sure whether I buy it. I'm still thinking through it. But the argument goes that AI, in fact, will be unlike other capital investments because it will increase in value over time as it incorporates more and more data. Anyway, the point here is that if it's going to be so tricky to get right, it's going to require so much human effort. To justify the investment, you're probably going to have to aim high. And so I think some companies are leading the way in showing us how to do that. That leads us to our sort of mid-range idea. Okay, so your business has been analyzing data for a long time. What people call AI now is often a progression or an extension of what we were calling big data 10 or 15 years ago. The difference now, though, is that a bigger opportunity is presenting itself. Now there's a chance to move from getting business intelligence, passive insights about the business, to having computers take more actions with direct business benefits. And again, I stress, this doesn't mean putting your company on autopilot. Even if companies are going to be making tactical decisions, humans make the strategic ones. And it's interesting to see in practice how this is playing out. Many companies are using remote sensor data analyzed by machines to suggest or schedule preventative maintenance on equipment. And that's better than waiting for a failure to occur or unnecessarily performing maintenance on some schedule that's kind of arbitrarily determined and is too early, right? It'd be a waste of money to perform the maintenance before it's actually needed. Some companies are using text analysis software to read contracts and invoices. They can automatically label the accounting conditions in contracts that might or might not reflect what happened in reality. There's a big consumer products company, for example, that uses this kind of text analysis software to get a handle on its relationships with stores that send in requests for repayments for promotions. The software actually analyzed what were the terms of the promotional deal with the stores. These are process improvements, and they add up nicely. They can save companies money. But some companies are asking themselves bigger questions. And that's something to think about. And what these companies are exploring is whether systems technologies will not just save them money, but will also lead them to new revenue opportunities. I was really interested to see a case study that there's a data analytics service provider called Kinetica. And one of the case studies they use very prominently is the Lippo Group, which is an enormous Indonesian conglomerate. This company, the Lippo Group, owns everything from TV networks and movie theaters to supermarkets, hotels, schools, hospitals, and even cemeteries. So the Lippo Group, the story the Lippo Group tells about their use of this technology is that they've managed now to link customer data across all of these businesses and share marketing insights among them essentially in real time. So now any of these businesses in this whole company can customize their offerings in one store based on what another store learned, based, even for example, on whether a woman is pregnant and likely then to respond to specific offers. So as this slide from the company shows, though perhaps not super clearly, this gets unbelievably detailed, down to whether someone lives in a 2-bedroom apartment or whether someone likes a certain kind of ice cream. Now, what's especially interesting to me is not merely that the company is doing this. It's kind of obvious, I guess. But what stood out in this case study to me is that the company, in addition to using this data internally, sells some of these insights to other companies through an online API. So now you have this massive conglomerate, what might otherwise just be a holding company, capturing more value, or at least trying to capture more value by also being a data broker. The business has changed. Meanwhile, being a data broker is a business that's experiencing rapid technological change itself. Companies that once were in the business of selling data, like Axiom and Quantium, are themselves refining their data, their business models. Once primarily they sold mailing lists, now they sell algorithmically generated marketing recommendations about you. They don't have to tell a bank exactly what it is they know about you, but they'll recommend to the bank that you be offered a certain kind of product. So, look, I mentioned this not to endorse this somewhat extreme model of what Harvard Business School professor Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism. I'm personally often dubious that hyper targeted marketing like this is always a killer app for the consumer. So I bring it up not to endorse it or recommend it as a business model. I bring it up just to point out that if something like this is possible across a huge conglomerate with so many disparate data sources, you should ask what kind of business model changes might be possible in your organization with a wise use of systems technologies. For example, I mentioned the service provider, the IT services provider Genpact earlier. They're also doing some interesting work to rethink the insurance business. In one pilot project, the company is exploring whether car insurance companies could stop sending out a claims adjuster to you after you've had a fender bender. So what if they just someday process the claim off the picture you snapped after the accident. A computer could compare those pictures that you send in to those that are in a database of other accidents, a database that's constantly labeled, with the cost those accidents ultimately rang up. And there would be a pretty good estimate instantly of what the claim is likely to cost. Another project is exploring what might happen if insurance companies directly funded the rollout of sensor technologies in homes, smart home technologies. That the consumer use case might be murky. But if insurance companies were to change their model and fund this more directly, perhaps these sensors would not only detect problems in the home, like a leak in the basement, but they could also begin to address them. Maybe the sensor network that detects a leak shuts off the water, and it contacts the insurance company to speed the process of getting a claim paid out. I mean, there's lots of ways you could see this working, but regardless of how it works, there's a bigger transformation afoot. The head of this business line at Genpact, Jeff Say, says that the technologies could help the insurance companies evolve from being a transactional player to being more of a trusted advisor and protector. So this kind of thing stood out to me in a survey of more than 3,000 executives that was published last month in Sloan Management Review. 28% of these 3,000 executives said AI had already led to some kind of business model change in their company. Now, the report is a little murky on what counts as a business model change, and it's not always clear what's going on. But even the authors of the Sloan report said they were surprised that 28% of the respondents had already leveraged what they were calling AI to alter their company's business model. However, that's probably nothing because most executives now expect this to happen in the next 5 years. That's a reminder of what you're up against in your own organizations. If you think of computerized systems primarily as a way to automate old practices, does that leave you vulnerable to some newcomer who avoids those practices entirely? Is there some change in business model that you could make before that happens? Brian Arthur, the economist and historian of technology, put this idea in very big terms in a 2009 book called The Nature of Technology. Arthur foresaw the entire economy changing along these lines thanks to highly configurable technologies. In this type of economy, he predicted, management would derive competitive advantage not from the traditional practice of turning stuff into finished goods, but instead, management's competitive advantage would come from constantly translating, quote, its deep expertise into ever new strategic combinations. So that leads back to my overall point here. If your company is to have a point of making that kind of transformation, if your company is to have a chance of making that kind of transformation, it's not going to originate with the technology. It's not going to be dreamed out by the technology. It will originate with the people who will have to make it happen, and its success will depend on them. And that's why it's best to have as many people as possible in an organization who understand what the technology truly enables and what it can't do, and do not think of the technology as someone else's problem. Okay, let's come back to this formulation that I described at the outset. The truly intelligent system should be your own organization, enlightened by advanced computing, but always cognizant of its limitations and structured accordingly. So what does it mean for employees to fully wrap their heads around both aspects of that, the power and the limitations of these systems technologies? This is some really heady stuff, and it'll be tricky to get this right. But if your company gets this right, then your company can stand out for its leadership. If you get it right, your company can help to articulate a vision of the future in which people are truly augmented by machines rather than threatened by machines. A future in which the work people do is more fulfilling and more engaging and more productive. This quote is from Brian Christian's book, The Most Human Human. Now, Brian Christian is a programmer and a writer And this book emerged from his experience about 10 years ago in a chatbot contest known as the Loebner Prize. So that's a competition inspired by the Turing test. In this competition, human judges will have instant message exchanges with a chatbot and with a real live human. And then after 5 minutes, the judge will try to determine which was the person and which was the machine. So the creator of the chatbot that most often passes as a human wins a prize. And there's also a secondary honor, not an actual prize, but a way to go, for the human who was least often mistaken for a machine. That's the most human. And that's what Brian Christian was hoping to be. And in thinking about that, how to pull that off, how would you never be mistaken for a bot? He goes on an engaging philosophical exploration of the nature of cognition and the differences between what humans and machines fundamentally are. And that's where he takes us in this book. So Christian's point here is that we should honor and make the most of those differences between human and machine. Let machines do what they do better than people, and let people do what they do better than machines. Now, as Christian points out, and what this quote gets to, is that a lot of work today is still essentially stuck in the middle. Many people's jobs are still machine-like in their repetitive drudgery. There are people in services jobs, data entry positions, even customer-facing roles who have to stick to precise protocols, read off scripts, and they have little to no creative leeway. They probably would say they feel like a robot or a drone, at which point it really can't be long before an actual robot or a drone replaces them. What Christian is saying here, and I think is worth thinking about, is that when that happens, when an actual robot or drone replaces a person whose role is that limited, what's to blame for that person's loss of a job? Is it the automation technology? Or is it the unimaginative system that so narrowly defined a person's role in the first place, reducing a human soul to an unthinking cog? Now, to be clear, I don't take this as economic policy. This is by no means an argument for eliminating all these jobs overnight. People still need these jobs, often badly. Even the fear that routine, boring jobs are going to go away is wreaking havoc with our society. What Christian, though, is doing here is he's thinking in the right direction. He's articulating a spiritual goal. And that's to use technology in ways that elevate people and require them to draw on quintessentially human activities, quintessentially human qualities whenever possible, so that they're not merely occupied with busy work. How possible is that? Well, obviously there's an enormous skills gap right now. But this is something to strive for in your company, which should naturally want people to be as motivated and engaged as possible. This stood out to me in a recent report from Accenture. In general, a lot of what people do at work involves activities that a machine probably can do or probably will do or will be able to do in the next 10 years. This is according to the authors of the Accenture report. That's their judgment that technology will be able to do this 38% of what workers do in the next 10 years. But that doesn't necessarily mean their positions ought to vanish or will vanish. On the contrary, in most of what people do, technology can help them and still fall well short of entirely replacing them. And there's many ways that can play out, from the manufacturing floor to executive suites. And this is everything from augmented reality goggles that guide manufacturing and repair workers, the systems that optimize staffing in retail stores or recommend particular products for the human sales staff to offer. And this dynamic, of course, varies widely by the type of work people do. Given what many of you and your companies do, you might be especially interested in this. This is how the research projects this dynamic in science and engineering positions. The name of the game here is much more about people working with technology than being cut out of the equation. But no matter what the company is or the type of work, managing a workforce to be this adaptable, to be changeable, to understand that their job is going to change with technology. Technology is going to become a coworker. That's very hard work. to have people be that adaptable. Rather than treating people like disposable parts who do one lame task, it'll take patience and new kinds of job training, more experiential learning. You're going to hear a lot more and more of that phrase, experiential learning, in the next few years, because it's probably the only way to help people see the big picture and not be hyper-specialized. The best stuff is going to happen across disciplines and specialties. Michael Jordan, not the basketball player who got his start up the road, but Michael I. Jordan, a professor of data science and computing at Berkeley. He has a very interesting idea that everything I'm describing here about how to manage people's relationship with computing needs to be the basis of an entire new form of engineering. A new discipline of engineering should emerge to actually manage and inspire how people best relate with technology. So what intrigues me about this mindset, which is, again, that our organizations are the intelligence systems, is really how natural this really all should be. In the most ancient of archaeological sites, what do we see? We see that this is what humans do. We build tools. This is something the computing pioneer Doug Engelbart articulated at the beginning of the digital age. And he said, computers should augment our intelligence, extend our problem-solving prowess, and usefully coexist with our own human intuition. Engelbart wrote this in a report on augmented human intellect that he led for the Air Force Office of Scientific Research in 1962. And it would go on to become the basis of his work in the graphical user interface and the computer mouse and many other foundational aspects of how we interact with machines. But even though Engelbart is a widely admired figure, I think some of the best ideas here are getting lost in the popular discussion of AI and automation and algorithmic judgment. Note how he's not merely talking about getting a job done or solving a problem by the most efficient means necessary. He's talking about improving human comprehension, which is a different thing than efficiency. Improving human comprehension. That's not what happens, however, if the output of a computer is seen as coming from some oracle whose workings are a total mystery. Why does the machine assume a certain view of the world? How did the machine come up with this answer? If I can't explain that to a customer, a coworker, a regulator, has my comprehension of the world gone up or has it gone down? Here's another version of this idea from the computer scientist and psychologist J.C.R. Licklider in 1960, a very seminal paper about a man-machine symbiosis. Now, the really big idea here has, to me, echoes of Brian Christian. It's that computers should assist us without us becoming like machines. And to me, this is the heart of what smart organizations will come to terms with in the coming years. Computers excel at following protocol. That's what they do. That's what we want them to do. Humans can't always be hemmed in by protocol. We sometimes need to, should be allowed to, override protocols. And that's true whether the protocol here is encoded by a computer or fellow humans. One of my favorite examples of this is Stanislav Petrov. Raise your hand if you know who this is. Okay, he's a Soviet military officer who in 1983 saved the world. Early one morning, during a relatively tense period in the Cold War, Soviet computers tied to early warning satellites indicated that the Americans had launched 5 nuclear missiles their way. And, I think this part is perhaps most crucial, the computers said their confidence in this information was at the highest level. Petrov had only minutes to decide how to report the situation to his superiors. These were people who had a direct line to the Soviet premier. Now, what he decided to do was the right thing. As it turned out, he reported the alert, and even the high confidence level stemmed from the malfunction. The world went on. But what's instructive here is that Petrov had no hard evidence at all that there had been a malfunction. He was just going off instinct. He later said that his training had taught him that if the Americans, if they ever really were going to strike, that we would have done it with more than 5 missiles. Training and intuition. The freedom to do more than follow a predetermined course of action. There's echoes of Engelbart and Licklider in that. So look, I imagine the fate of the world isn't at stake in your companies, but people's lives and livelihoods are. And in the companies we should be building, we'll need people to be guided by computers without being inflexibly dependent on them. They'll need to think of these technologies as tools, like a carpenter's hammer, not like a magic wand. So if it were up to me to design the training programs in companies like yours, I would make sure that people are drilled in all the ways computers are likely to mess things up. If computers are going to be our coworkers, and I think they should be, we're going to need to know their strengths and weaknesses. Now, even the most adept computing companies bungle this stuff. It's insane. It's a little bit scary. This is a recent story about Amazon. Understandably, Amazon wanted to automate some of the process of sifting through resumes for the thousands upon thousands of job openings it has. Less understandably, it automated too much of the process. Amazon failed to adequately query how the system worked. What data was it analyzing? How was it weighting certain factors? So as it happened, it kind of looked good because it was trained on a very big data set. It included the resumes that the company had received over a 10-year span. However, it was a flawed data set, despite being big. Because most resumes came from men, the model learned to favor phrases that were used by men and experiences men tended to put on their resumes. It hadn't seen enough resumes from women in its training, and so then in practice, its scoring system penalized resumes that mentioned certain all-female colleges or even had the word women's in it. The system made Amazon blind to promising female candidates. Now, you might say they deployed an intelligent system technology, but this was not an intelligent organizational decision. This was not smart. Now, what happened next was smart, and to Amazon's credit, if this Reuters story is accurate. So tellingly, even when the company's engineers tried to adjust the algorithm to overcome these flaws, they couldn't be sure that they had rid the system of its discriminatory practices. And this wasn't just a matter of fairness for fairness' sake. This was costing the company some potentially great female candidates. This was really bad. So it scrapped the system, according to Reuters. And, that makes me think back to Martin Zinkovich's 43 rules of machine learning. Remember number 1? Sometimes it's okay to launch a product that doesn't involve machine learning. Now, look, this kind of algorithm is going to be back. It's already back. Just this last week, LinkedIn rolled out a hiring resume sorting algorithm that is supposedly meant to intentionally address these kinds of shortcomings that have existed in purely unadulterated resume sorting algorithms. And it may work, it may not. But the question here is to not just assume that you can, with a few tweaks to the software, fix the underlying problem. You have to constantly be thinking, what blind spots might this technology have? Other technologies of computers getting things wrong abound. And I would make sure, everybody in a company knows this so that they actually do, as by second nature, what people at Amazon failed to do, which was to deeply query the assumptions underlying the system, and ask how it came up with its conclusions. If everybody in your company knew some of these stories, they might ask these questions about things you want to roll out in your companies. Some of these are kind of funny, right? These things that come up in academic settings. There was a machine that supposedly could accurately detect tumors. Which tumors were cancerous, rather. But it actually turned out that this system was really adept at spotting rulers. Because in the training data, the biggest tumors were photographed next to rulers that indicated the tumor scale. Maybe you've heard about the computer that when it was told to put some lists in order, deleted the lists, so the list would no longer be out of order. The technologist and tech critic, Jaron Lanier, in a piece he wrote for me once in MIT Technology Review, gave me one of my favorite examples. Does anybody here know what Goodstein sequences are in math? I definitely did not. These are functions whose initial numerical outputs go up, and seem like they always will go up. But there's something in the function that makes them always revert and fall to zero. And statistical analysis of the early phase of these sequences could miss the inescapable conclusion that the long-term result of this function is zero. Correlations break down. Extrapolations can fail. That's the lesson here. So look, I want to reiterate, my point here is not to put down AI, if we have to call it that, as being hopelessly inept. I hope you know by now, I think it's a very powerful tool. But instead, the point is that evaluating how and when to put its power to use, when to really use this tool, should be a very thorough and nuanced process that always gets reevaluated. Life is messy. Things aren't always what they seem. People need to know they can and should always interrogate what their tools actually can do for them. Their companies will depend on it. Let me close with a story that I hope captures this idea. So one of the most interesting applications of algorithmic systems in recent years has been in the criminal justice system. As you may have heard, there are now systems that analyze several factors about defendants or prisoners and calculate the likelihood that they will reoffend. So this software is being used to advise judges on bail, sentencing, and parole. Now, if you've heard of this software at all, you've probably heard of it because of analysis by ProPublica that showed big flaws in these systems. These articles showed that the software tended to overestimate the chance that a Black person would commit a crime in the future, and it tended to underestimate the chance that a white person would commit a crime in the future. So in essence, this software was likely reinforcing disparities in criminal justice. That's bad. But that's not why I bring up this story. And it's not the only thing I want you to remember. What interests me is a more basic, fundamental question. Why does this software exist in the first place? What is it meant to do? Why might we want this tool? So advocates of this system hope, or say they hope, that software can be fairer than human judges, because the software makes none of the emotional decisions that we know riddle human decision making. Now, to demonstrate the problem of human bias, which we know exists, advocates of algorithmic justice like to point to this study. It got a lot of attention in 2011. This is The Economist's coverage. So this study looked at parole decisions by judges in Israel over a 10-month period. And these records indicated that judges were less lenient right before meal breaks. The presumption was that the judges' decisions are heavily influenced by whether they're hungry or mentally taxed after several hours of hearing cases. And if that's true, then it makes sense, or it might make sense, to ask a computer to weigh in. But is that underlying premise true? Is human bias so clearly delineated that we can program a computer to work around it purely by doing statistical analysis? Well, the comparison to humans is more complicated than that. It turns out that the researchers who analyzed the data missed something when they identified lunch breaks as the prime factor in decision making. Other researchers went back and looked at the data. They re-examined it, and then they got some more of their own. And they found that the judges heard cases in batches. All the cases from one prison would be heard in a batch, and then there would be a meal break, and then another group of prisoners would be heard after the meal break. And the way the judges structured this docket was that in each batch, the prisoners who did not have attorneys went last. The prisoners who were representing themselves were the ones heard right before the meal breaks. So all of a sudden, the meal breaks themselves don't seem as significant as the fact that prisoners without attorneys are less likely to get a favorable outcome. So what do we do with this information? We know human biases can be problematic in general, and we want to reduce the problem. But does the data convincingly show that this calls by default for computer assistance? That it calls for a computer assistance rather than some other kind of solution or set of solutions? Especially since, if we're thoughtful about it, we'll recognize that a computer-driven solution will have biases and blind spots of its own. Now, I'm not here to pronounce a verdict on this, if you'll excuse the pun. I'm just trying to say, though, that we want to be asking these questions. That's going to be the basis of a truly intelligent organization. Get as much data as you can, but stay open to the fact that the data doesn't necessarily mean what you think it means. The best reality check a company can have is to be staffed full with people who understand this, people who can draw on their expertise in your industry and think clearly about what your technological tools can do and what they can't. Now, before I wrap up entirely, I just want to give you some suggestions on how to facilitate this kind of thinking and thought process in your organizations. I mentioned Brian Christian's book, but Meredith Broussard and Edward Tenner have been invaluable for me. They do a great job of explaining why it's actually sometimes counterproductive, inefficient in the long run, to expect computers to do things that are actually best left for humans. And the last book on the list by Dougherty and Wilson, who are both at Accenture, this book is much more bullish than I am on the prospects for AI in the next few years, but it goes into great detail about the specific kinds of skills and training that will be required in companies where companies augment people rather than replace them altogether. And impressively, they're donating their royalties from the book to programs that aim to teach the kinds of job skills that the next decade will demand. And then finally, news on what we'll call AI comes fast. And if you want to be able to put ongoing developments in perspective, I cannot recommend enough Azim Azhar. He's an investor in Britain. He has a email newsletter that comes out every Sunday. Highly recommend anyone who cares about this subject to subscribe. Also, the roboticist Rodney Brooks has taught me a lot about how things that look exponential are not always exponential. Great reality check on separating hype from reality. If you're on Twitter, or if you're just even open to eavesdropping on Twitter, here are some people who are super smart and thoughtful on this subject. Anyway, thank you for your time. Thank you for thinking. I'm looking forward to your questions.
At this point, we'll take some questions in the audience. Please raise your hand and wait for the microphone. Thanks.
Great talk. Thanks very much. Jeff Alexander with RTI. I have a totally different question than I thought I was going to ask because of your last anecdote about the sentencing in Israel, which is if we're relying on statistics that may be faulty to kind of give us guidance on what we're going to automate, and we know that there's a lot of bad social science out there, is it a limit on our ability to use artificial intelligence, the quality of social science that we do, and that we really need to invest in better social science to make sure that we're double checking machines adequately?
Right. I mean, I think it's probably all of the above. Is this mic working, by the way? Can you hear me? I'll stand here. That's fine. Yeah, I think it's all of the above. Again, I mean, it may be that there are good technical solutions to come up with in that kind of setting, but as it turns out, these algorithms that were used, the ones that ProPublica examined, they were based on what I think is probably pretty flimsy social science. To your point, they were based on a questionnaire. The scoring for people's likelihood to reoffend was based on a questionnaire that the prisoners themselves filled out about their upbringing. Did they know anybody when they were a kid who committed a crime, and their income level as a kid, and so on. And so it took assumptions that may or may not kind of hold out but is that really how you want to determine someone's likelihood of reoffending, to look at how they were raised? There's probably some statistical correlation, but that surely can't be the best way to get justice, right? I mean, these are slippery concepts to begin with, and these are things that are hard to define. It feels like a tricky thing to expect a computer to improve the situation rather than making it more murky. I don't know if Nita is here we got into this in the last panel. I'd love for her to cede the floor to Nita Farahani if she's here on this subject, but anyway. Any other question? I'm actually curious. I'll ask you a question. If anybody thinks I'm totally naive or wrong about the idea of computers being intelligent by 2025, does that strike you guys as off? Well, maybe it's wishful thinking that we'll have intelligent organizations, but I think we can strive for it. I mean, the only chance we've got, right?
Thanks. This is Richard Boyd with Tanjo. local machine learning company. In 2015, I believe at Davos, a blue ribbon panel of really smart people got together there, as they do, and predicted that by this time, by 2018, we'd be seeing double-digit Dow returns and double-digit unemployment, and then heavy reliance on government, potentially including, universal income, that sort of thing. We're seeing the Dow returns, but we haven't seen the unemployment and the government stuff. So I'm just interested in your perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, this is wild, right? This goes back to Bob Solow, the MIT economist in the 80s, saying that the PC era was showing up everywhere except in the productivity numbers. This is the same kind of thing. It's like, depending on where you look, you could say like advanced computing now is having no impact, productivity and thus real wage growth kind of sluggish. But yeah, the unemployment rate is about as low as it can be. On the other hand, labor force participation is lower than it's been since like it's been declining steadily since the 1960s. So like, what's going on? Yeah, I think it gets back to the idea that like these technologies are really powerful, but like to use them in a way that just so transforms the need for labor, it's just going to take a long time. Actually, Martin Fleming of IBM in his presentation this morning actually said this. It was I thought like a breath of fresh air that this is a really big transformation, but these kind of big changes happen slowly. We kind of forget that. And I think that's actually like a good reminder that like, technological change isn't really exponential. There are certain exponential, like computers have gotten exponentially cheaper, sure. But like, is life that much different now than it was in 2016 or 2015? So if there's really exponential growth happening because of these technologies, like every month would be different from the next after a certain while. So it's a good reality check. I don't have an answer to your other question earlier too about capital versus labor. I think this actually sharpens that conflict, but it's another matter.
Hi, Steve Moskowitz from Integra. So very good talk. And I think a lot of the comments you made about the organization and the workforce and how do we think about people is very good. I see a lot of companies struggling with, processes and how do you, go through that process of where do you start and how do you start here? One of the comments you made was one of the tweets you showed was around, this is being 100 times harder than mobile. And I think a lot of the companies here, at least folks I've talked to, we're just stepping our toes in, and in all cases we skipped over mobile, right? We didn't, we're not software companies, and so we're going right from kind of our traditional way of doing things to this whole fundamentally new way of doing things. And one of the challenge I see is, and I think you made the point of who's really driving it, and in a lot of cases it's our technology folks who are driving it versus the HR team, and kind of how do you see that dynamic of who should be the leaders in the company who are really influencing where we're headed? Is it technology? Is it HR? And how does that balance out?
Yeah, there was a survey recently. I brought up the Sloan survey, and I can't remember if it's in that. I've been reading so much of this stuff lately. I can get you the exact one, but CEOs were surveyed on what's driving this in their companies, and it's actually, I think, like a plurality, like the most common answer, but not still less than half, was what was driving it was some attempt to better understand the customer, better reach the customer. Hiring, I think, was second. I may have that wrong. Those are the top two. So to improve kind of like HR or the internal company management, but to better understand and better reach the customer and to speed interactions with the customer, from what I'm gathering, seems to be driving it.
Time for one more question. There's one.
Thanks. I'm Kathy Lohr, distinguished fellow, emeritus now at RTI. And probably correctly, you focused on organizations and companies, of which RTI is a renowned one. But I keep wondering, to what extent can you think through how this sort of movement and transformation affects those who are not in organizations? People who run farms, people who run ranches, coal miners, other sorts of people who don't have as much access to this kind of thing, certainly not in the US, given our appalling rate of internet and in rural areas and so forth. So what do you see about people who aren't embedded in organizations and companies?
Yeah, I mean, if these technologies are meant to turn superhuman or inhuman amounts of data into insights, you don't really have superhuman amounts of data to process. I mean, there's nothing to say that, like, what's your machine learning solution going to be? You know, I mean, it depends. Obviously, you know, farms and farming, agriculture generates a lot of data that, you know, people are starting to put to creative use, you know, to optimize yields and other techniques. I don't know much about what systems exist to democratize that, or through like extension programs, agricultural extension programs, and farmer cooperatives. You know, are they sharing those insights? You know, yeah. Look, this technology, if it makes people with more data more and more powerful, it's going to only accelerate the dynamic by which the small independent producer is at a disadvantage, potentially, right? I mean, there could be another a counterbalancing to that, where, look, small imperfect craftsman artisanal products, you know, are that's some companies' bailiwick, right? But I think you're raising a really interesting point, that to the owners of most of the, you know, to the owners of big data sets can flow, you know, there's this winner take all dynamic. So that's a huge thing to expect in these alternative futures you'll be envisioning tomorrow. Yeah.
Hi, so this is Gail Beeler from RTI. My question is about education. You were talking about workers that were already, you know, in the workforce. What about, I'm also concerned about people yet in the workforce, and how there's a skills gap, not only in the workforce, but there's a skills gap in teachers and professors who have been at institutions for a long time, may be great at what they did 30, 40 years ago, but have not kept up. So how quickly do you think, you know, that is going to change, and are we set up for that change, or not?
Yeah. I have a 13-year-old and a 10-year-old, and I can see that we're not set up for it to change, at least in my school system, which is a very well functioning, you know, school system. Yeah, this is a really big problem. This worries me. Andrew Ng, who is a computer scientist, AI pioneer, really thoughtful, has said that AI will be like electricity, in the sense that it's just going to be, remember I said like machine learning will become a standard part of software development? What he's saying is, like, this level of data analysis will be the substrate upon which all businesses and much of society run, right? Like electricity, it'll be that transformative, you know? Well, like, imagine how education needed to change for a world in which that was being electrified, and, you know, industrialization was going to rapidly speed up, and I mean, you know, whatever. So if we're really at that threshold of something just fundamentally changing, yeah, I don't know. I wish I had the answer to that. I share your concern that we're still kind of. I will say this though. I think one thing that people have started to realize in the last few years, which I find heartening, I'd rather end on a heartening note, is I feel like maybe 5 to 8 years ago, everything was about STEM, obsessive attention on, like, are we training enough computer programmers? Are people going to have enough STEM education? In the last few years, I think actually because of some of the, like, grievous errors that engineers have made with algorithms, we're learning that the whole human, with a whole understanding of ethics and our role in a society and our obligations to each other, right? And you know, the humanities and our, like, how we got here. Like, I think there's a renewed appreciation for an education that's less tactical, like STEM. I think that's actually, I'm heartened by that. STEAM, yeah.
Okay, please join me in thanking Brian for a great talk.
Thank you.
So